In this tutorial, we're gonna answer the question when to use an independent sample t-test, or another name for independent sample t-test is two-sample t-test. So when we use two-sample t-test is the question that this tutorial would address. To begin with, independent sample t-test is among the parametric test. Among the parametric tests that we use to compare the means of two groups. So an important point in understanding independent sample t-test is there should be two groups. Okay, example, female students and male students. Okay, another example of two groups is rural residents and urban residents. Another group is male-headed households and female-headed households. Okay, example of two groups. Therefore, in independent sample t-test, we need to have two groups, like female students and male students, rural residents and urban residents, male-headed households and female-headed households. There are two groups. So inherently, in independent sample t-test, we need to have two groups. And next, the purpose. Okay, the purpose of sorry, here I wrote two not properly. Purpose. The purpose of independent sample t-test is to compare means. To compare means or average values. Okay, mean means average. So the purpose, we use t-test to compare and contrast the means or the average values of two groups. Okay, the point is that whether there is the aim of using independent sample t-test or two sample t-test is to ensure whether or not there is average value difference between two groups. Okay, whether or not there is difference in means of two groups. Okay, so we need to have two groups, and the purpose or the aim of independent sample t-test is to compare the means of two groups. Okay, for example, the academic performance, okay, in terms of test record, okay, in terms of exam record between female students and male students. Okay, there is a group of female students on one hand and a group of male students on another hand. Then there would be average result of female students, and there would be average results of male students on one hand, and then a t-test helps us to compare and contrast the means or the average values, the average test results or exam results of female students and male students, to find out whether or not there is a difference, okay, in average result, in average value, in means between the two groups. Or we can use t-test to find out whether or not there is income difference between rural residents and urban residents in a particular country. Okay, we measure we would collect data from the rural residents regarding their annual income. Okay, we change the harvest that the farm yield, and then we turn it into monetary values. And then for the urban residents, we do the same measurement of turning their economic activities into monetary value, and then we can compare and contrast the average values or their annual income, average annual income of the rural residents and urban residents, to find out whether or not there is an average income difference between rural residents and urban residents. Likewise, we can also compare and contrast the average income of male-headed households and female-headed households, okay, to find out whether there is a difference between the two groups. We can measure the food security of male-headed households and female-headed households, and using the measurements of food security, we would get value for male-headed household group, and female-headed household group, and then we compare and contrast the average food security value of both groups. Therefore, the point is that independent sample t-test helps us to find out whether or not there is difference between the two groups based on how, on a continuous variable. Okay, so let us sort out the variables that exist in independent sample t-test. Look, let me go to specify the variables. For example, we need to have two variables. We need to have two variables. We need to have two variables. I raised it in my explanation of the difference between the two groups, but let me make it more practical. One dependent variable and one independent variable. One dependent variable and one independent variable. Look, okay, and the dependent variable need to be continuous. Okay, must be continuous, and the independent variable must be categorical. Must be categorical. Okay. Example. The dependent variable can be income. Okay, income as dependent variable. And rural residents or residents. Okay, residents as independent variable. Independent variable. And look, income is dependent variable and residents are independent variable. There is one dependent variable and one independent variable. And once again, in the independent variable, there should be two groups. there should be two groups, and we have two groups in a variable termed as resident. Look, okay, we have two groups of residents: rural residents and urban residents. Okay, therefore when one is answering a question when to use an independent sample t-test, he would answer like we would use independent sample t-test when we have one dependent variable which is continuous. And give me a little latitude to explain a continuous variable. Continuous variable is a variable that is measured in terms of natural number, like income, like the height of the people's status, like for example weight, okay, or count of people, or money, like that. Okay, when a variable is measured in terms of natural number, then that variable is said to be a continuous variable. Okay, like income, age. Okay, age, you use a natural number to measure age, and you say 20 years old, 30 years old, 45 years old, and like that. Income 2,000, 3,000, like that. And height, 1 meter and 50 centimeter, 1 meter 80 centimeter, like that. Okay, in terms of inch, it's the same thing. Weight in kilograms, and 30 kilogram, 40 kilogram, like that. It's natural, natural in terms of natural numbers, and it can take even like a number like 15.5 or 15.5 and 10 point, like that. Okay, that is why we call it a continuous variable. Independent variable, when we come to independent variable, it need to be categorical, and when we say categorical, it should have groups. Okay, it should have groups within itself, and the groups need to be just two, must be two groups in the dependent variable. In the independent variable, there should be only two groups in the case of independent sample test. So when one is answering the question when to use an independent sample t-test or two sample t-test, he would say, or she would say, we would use independent sample t-test when we have a one continuous dependent variable and one categorical independent variable, and our interest is to find out whether or not there is difference between the two groups based on the value of the dependent variable, based on the continuous measurement of the dependent variable. Okay, like when we take this example, income is dependent variable, and resident is independent variable, and our interest is whether, look, our interest is not is a statistically average income difference between rural residents rural residents and urban residents. Okay, our interest is to ascertain, to check whether or not ascertain, mistakenly spelled, okay. So we need to collect collect data from the rural residents on one hand and from the urban residents on another hand in terms of income. Okay, in terms of income, and then we're gonna compare, given the the data of the rural households and the urban households. Then we're gonna compare the average, okay, the average income of the two groups, and finally we will conclude there is a statistically significant difference. Okay, one way of conclude, when based on the finding, we could say that there is a statistically significant difference between the two groups in terms of income, or we could say there is no significant difference between the two groups in terms of income. This will depend on the on the p-value that we get from running independent sample t-tests in a statistical software like SPSS, Stata, or another else. And when independent sample t-test, when we use independent sample t-test, first we need to establish a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is the null hypothesis, and the alternate hypothesis should be established. And let me erase what I wrote. We need to establish sorry, something is wrong with me. Let me look, or like that. Hypothesis is necessary. Need to be established. And two hypotheses, like null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. Okay, and the null hypothesis, okay, the null hypothesis of independent sample t-test is that there is no, when we say null, it is none, okay, right? There is no mean difference between the two groups. Like when our interest is to find out the difference between rural households, the income, the difference of income between rural households and urban households, then the null hypothesis would be there is no mean difference, okay, average income difference between the two groups, rural households and urban households. Or another example, let us assume our interest is to find out whether or not there is average exam result difference between male students and female students, and then in this case a null hypothesis would be there is no average exam result difference between male groups of male students, a group of male students and group of female students, like that. Or let us say in terms of food security value, we could say that there is no difference between average food security value difference between male-headed households and female-headed households, like that. Therefore, always one would write the null hypothesis of independent sample test like that, because there is no mean difference. And conversely, alternative hypothesis is written like this. It is direct opposite of the null hypothesis. There is a statistically significant difference between the two groups. Okay, it is the opposite of the null hypothesis. Okay, opposite of the null hypothesis. And finally, the purpose of independent sample t-test is either to reject or accept the null hypothesis. And to either reject or accept the null hypothesis, what is important in independent sample t-test is p-value or significance. It appears like seek in the result of statistical software like Stata and SPSS. Okay, and when the seek or p-value is in social science, it could be 0.1. Okay, 0.1, I mean it need to be below 0.1. Okay, 0.1 means 10%, and the extent of error, okay, the margin of error in social science could be tolerated to 10%, but usually one would take 5%, which is 0.05, which is 0.05 like this. Okay, so when the error of margin, it depends upon the researcher's decision, and it may vary from researcher to researcher based on the field in which on the subject of the study. And let us assume the p-value is 0.1, okay, or the margin of error is set at 0.1 or at 10%, and we could say that the null hypothesis is rejected if and only if the p-value or the seek value falls under or is below 0.1, or if it is 0.5, if it is set, if the margin of error is set at 0.05 or 5%, then it need to be below 0.05, equal to or less than 0.05. Okay, in this case, if the p-value is less than or equal to 0.1 in case of 10% margin of error, or less than or equal to 0.05 in case of 5% margin of error, then we could say null hypothesis is rejected and alternative hypothesis is accepted instead. And if the p-value or the seek value from the result of the statistical software like SPSS and Stata is greater than 0.1, or in case of 10% margin of error, or greater than 0.05 in case of 5% margin of error, then the alternate hypothesis need to be accepted, and the alternate hypothesis need to be rejected. Okay, the null hypothesis is accepted when the data that we collected and run in the statistical software fails to reject the null hypothesis. In a sense, when the p-value or the seek value is greater than the margin of error that we set. If we set 10, then to accept the null hypothesis, the p-value or the seek value should be greater than the margin of error, like greater than 10% or greater than 5% in case of 5% margin of error. So this is the theoretical explanation of how of when we use independent sample t-test or two sample t-test. Next, I will show you how to practically run given data independent sample t-test in Stata and in SPSS, and we're gonna interpret this result practically. I told you in terms of just narration, but in the next tutorial we would be learning it in practical terms. Thank you very much.